Some secrets are whispered in the shadows, hidden behind closed doors, and locked away in the hearts of those who carry them. But others, darker, more forbidden, cling to you like a second skin, impossible to shed. Adrian and Isabel shared a bond so profound it defied the boundaries of family, of morality, and of reason itself. What began as a love born from loneliness would grow into an obsession so consuming that it threatened to destroy everything in its path. This is not a story of happy endings. It is a tale of passion, betrayal, and the dangerous line between devotion and destruction. The small, secluded town of Willow Creek was known for its quiet streets and close-knit community. Tucked away on the outskirts was the Devereux Estate, a sprawling property surrounded by tall, ivy-covered walls that seemed to guard the secrets within. Inside lived the Devereux family, stern, distant parents and their two children, Adrian and Isabel. Adrian, 3 years older than Isabel, had always been her protector. Their parents were cold and controlling, more concerned with their social reputation than the happiness of their children. The siblings were left to fend for themselves emotionally, forming a bond that grew stronger with each passing year. On rainy days, they'd retreat to the old attic filled with dusty books and forgotten treasures. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the rigid expectations of their parents. Adrian would tell stories to make Isabel laugh, and Isabel would sing soft melodies that brought peace to her brother's restless mind. "Promise me," Adrian said one evening as they watched the rain streak down the attic window. "No matter what happens, it'll always be just us." "Always," Isabel whispered, her small hand slipping into his. It was an innocent promise, made with the purest intentions. As the years passed, the bond between Adrian and Isabel deepened. By the time Adrian was 17 and Isabel 14, their relationship began to shift in subtle, unspoken ways. Adrian had grown tall and confident, with sharp features that made the local girls whisper and giggle when he walked by. Isabel, too, was blossoming into a young woman, her delicate beauty drawing admiration from the boys in town. But Adrian didn't like the attention Isabel received. Whenever a boy lingered too long near her at the market or a neighborhood event, Adrian would step in with a cold glare or a sharp word. "They're not good enough for you," he'd say, his tone final. One summer evening, as they sat by the lake behind their home, Isabel shyly brought up the topic of love. "Do you ever think about what it's like?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. "To be in love." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Love is complicated," he replied. "Most people don't understand it. They just play games." "Not everyone," Isabel said softly. "Some people mean it." Adrian turned to her, his eyes intense. "If someone loves you, they should never let you go. They should protect you, no matter what." Isabel felt a shiver run down her spine, though the evening was warm. Something about the way he looked at her made her heart race, a sensation she didn't fully understand. One stormy night, the siblings found themselves in the attic again, their favorite refuge. The rain lashed against the windows, and the flickering candlelight cast shadows on the walls. Adrian had been in a strange mood all day, distant and brooding. Isabel tried to cheer him up, teasing him about the girls who always seemed to fawn over him. "They're not important," Adrian said abruptly, cutting her off. He moved closer, his voice low. "The only person who matters to me is you." Isabel blinked, taken aback. "Adrian, what do you mean? You don't understand, do you?" He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're the only one who's ever really seen me. The only one I trust." The air between them grew heavy, charged with an emotion Isabel couldn't name. When Adrian leaned in, his lips brushing hers, she froze. It felt wrong, yet strangely inevitable, as though their years of closeness had been leading to this moment. "Adrian, we can't," she whispered, pulling back. Her voice trembled, but she didn't move far. "Why not?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "We belong to each other. No one else understands us." Isabel wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself drawn back into Adrian's embrace, her confusion and fear drowned out by the intensity of the moment. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing. Isabel avoided Adrian at first, terrified of what had happened between them. But Adrian was persistent, finding ways to be near her, to remind her of the bond they shared. "We're not doing anything wrong," he insisted one afternoon when he cornered her in the garden. "This is our secret, Isabel. No one else has to know." "But it is wrong," she argued, her voice breaking. "What if someone finds out?" "No one will," Adrian said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I won't let anyone hurt you or us. Promise me you'll trust me." Isabel hesitated, her heart warring with her mind. In the end, her love for her brother and her fear of losing him won out. "I promise," she said quietly. From that day on, their relationship became a tightly guarded secret. They avoided public displays of affection, maintaining the facade of a normal sibling bond. But behind closed doors, their connection grew deeper, fueled by their shared defiance of the world outside. Years passed, and Adrian and Isabel maintained their secret relationship, cloaked under the guise of sibling normalcy. To the outside world, they were a devoted brother and sister, but within the walls of the Devereux estate, their bond was far from ordinary. Adrian had grown into a man of striking presence, his intense demeanor masking the possessiveness that consumed him. Isabel, now in her late teens, had blossomed into a graceful young woman, her beauty catching the attention of suitors in their small town. Yet Adrian made sure none of them came too close. "Why do you always scare them away?" Isabel asked one evening after a boy she liked mysteriously stopped speaking to her. "They're not good enough for you," Adrian said sharply. "No one will ever love you the way I do." "But I want to have friends, Adrian," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I want to see what life is like beyond this house." Adrian's expression darkened. "You don't need anyone else. You have me." Isabel felt a pang of guilt. She loved Adrian deeply, but she couldn't ignore the growing unease in her heart. Their relationship had become a cage, and she longed to break free, even if she didn't yet have the courage to say so. Everything changed when Isabel met Mark. He was a newcomer to the town, a kind and charming young man who worked at the local library. Isabel was immediately drawn to his warmth and intelligence, and their shared love of books quickly brought them closer. At first, Isabel kept her friendship with Mark a secret, knowing how Adrian would react. But as their bond deepened, she could no longer hide it. One evening, as they sat in the garden, Isabel gathered her courage and spoke. "Adrian, I need to tell you something," she began hesitantly. "What is it?" Adrian asked, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "I've met someone," she said, her voice steadied despite her racing heart. "His name is Mark. He's special." The silence that followed was suffocating. Adrian's jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists. "You're joking," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not," Isabel said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I care about him, Adrian. And I want to see where it goes." Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone patio. "You don't know what you're doing," he said coldly. "He'll hurt you." "They all will." "That's not true," Isabel protested, standing as well. "Mark is different. He's kind." I said no." Adrian's voice thundered, cutting her off. "You belong to me, Isabel. No one else." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes. "I'm not yours, Adrian," she said softly. "I'm your sister." Adrian's face twisted in pain and fury, but he said nothing more. Instead, he stormed off, leaving Isabel alone in the darkening garden. Adrian's jealousy only grew in the weeks that followed. He began showing up at the library, glaring at Mark from a distance. He followed Isabel when she went out, making his presence known to anyone who dared approach her. Mark, oblivious to the full extent of Adrian's obsession, tried to reassure Isabel. "He's just protective," he said one evening as they walked through the park. "He'll come around eventually." But Isabel knew better. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Adrian, he's not like other brothers." Mark frowned. What do you mean? Isabel hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. It's complicated, she said finally. I just need you to trust me. I do, Mark said, taking her hand. But if he's making you unhappy, maybe it's time to set some boundaries. Isabel nodded, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Adrian's love was all-consuming, and she wasn't sure she could escape it without a fight. One evening, Adrian cornered Isabel in her room, his eyes blazing with anger. You're going to end it with him, he said, his voice low but threatening. No, Adrian, Isabel said firmly. I won't. I care about Mark, and I want to be with him. You don't know what you're saying, Adrian said, stepping closer. He'll take you away from me. He'll ruin everything we have. What we have isn't normal, Adrian, Isabel said, her voice trembling. It's not right. We can't keep living like this. Adrian's face fell, and for a moment, she saw the boy he used to be, vulnerable, desperate for love. You promised, he whispered. You said it would always be us. I was a child, Isabel said softly. I didn't know what I was promising. Adrian's expression hardened again. If you won't end it, I will, he said. I'll make sure no one ever comes between us. Before Isabel could respond, Adrian turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Isabel sank onto her bed, her heart heavy with dread. She knew Adrian meant every word he'd said, and she feared what he might do next. Adrian's words echoed in Isabel's mind, haunting her every step. True to his promise, Adrian began his campaign to sabotage her relationship with Mark. He used every means at his disposal to drive them apart, starting with spreading rumors. At the library where Mark worked, whispers began to circulate. Adrian had told anyone who would listen that Mark was a manipulative liar, someone who preyed on young women. Though Mark dismissed the rumors as baseless, they began to affect his reputation. People have been avoiding me, Mark said to Isabel one day as they strolled through town. I don't know what's going on. Isabel felt a pang of guilt. She knew exactly who was behind it. It'll pass, she said, squeezing his hand. Just don't let it get to you. But things only got worse. Adrian started showing up wherever they went, at the park, the cafe, even church. He would sit silently, his gaze fixed on them like a predator stalking its prey. The tension was unbearable. One evening, Adrian confronted Mark directly. Catching him alone as he left the library, Adrian stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. Mark, Adrian said, his tone cold and measured. We need to talk. Mark squared his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. What do you want, Adrian? I want you to stay away from my sister, Adrian said bluntly. She doesn't belong with someone like you. Mark frowned. Isabel is her own person. She can make her own decisions. Adrian's jaw tightened. You don't understand. Isabel is special. She deserves someone who truly cares for her, someone who knows her better than anyone else. I do care for her, Mark said firmly. And I won't let you control her life. Adrian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. This is your last warning. Leave, or you'll regret it. Mark held his ground, meeting Adrian's glare. I'm not going anywhere. Adrian's lips curled into a cold smile. We'll see about that. Adrian's attempts to drive Isabel and Mark apart became increasingly desperate. He began tampering with Mark's life, letting the air out of his tires, leaving threatening notes on his doorstep, even attempting to get him fired from his job. Mark grew more and more frustrated, but he refused to back down. Meanwhile, Isabel was caught in the middle. Adrian's possessiveness was suffocating her, but she couldn't bring herself to completely sever ties with him. Despite everything, he was still her brother, and a part of her still cared for him. One night, as Isabel sat alone in her room, Adrian barged in without knocking. Why are you still seeing him? He demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Because I love him, Isabel said, her voice steadied despite her fear. And you need to accept that. I can't, Adrian said, his voice breaking. I can't lose you, Isabel. You're all I have. You're not losing me, she said gently. But you have to let me go. You have to let me live my life. Adrian shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I can't do that, he said. I won't. The final straw came when Mark proposed to Isabel. Overjoyed, she accepted, eager to start a new life away from Adrian's shadow. But when Adrian found out, his rage knew no bounds. On the night of Isabel and Mark's engagement party, Adrian showed up uninvited. The guests fell silent as he stormed into the room, his eyes wild with fury. Isabel, he called out, his voice echoing in the hall. We need to talk. Isabel froze, her heart pounding. Adrian, not now, she said, trying to remain calm. This isn't the time or place. I don't care, Adrian said, striding toward her. You can't marry him. I won't let you. Mark stepped in front of Isabel, his expression firm. You need to leave, Adrian. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Stay out of this, he said. This is between me and my sister. She's my fiancée now, Mark said, his voice steady. You need to accept that. Adrian lunged at Mark, shoving him backward. The room erupted into chaos as guests tried to intervene, but Adrian's focus was solely on Mark. You're taking her away from me, Adrian said, his voice filled with desperation. I can't let that happen. Mark pushed Adrian away, his patience finally snapping. She's not yours, Adrian, he said. She's never been yours. The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood frozen, his face contorted with pain. Then, without warning, he turned and stormed out of the house. Adrian's jealousy spiraled into obsession. That night, he sat alone in his room, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. If he couldn't have Isabel, no one could. The next morning, Mark's car was found vandalized, its tires slashed and windows shattered. Later that week, Mark received a cryptic, threatening message, leave now, or there will be consequences. Mark reported the incident to the police, but there was little they could do without proof. Isabel, meanwhile, pleaded with Adrian to stop. You're ruining everything, she said, tears streaming down her face. Why can't you just let me be happy? Because you're mine, Adrian said, his voice cold and unyielding. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep you. Adrian's obsession consumed him entirely. He stopped going to work, cut off his friends, and spent his days plotting how to tear Isabel and Mark apart. His room became a shrine to their shared past, a place filled with old photographs, trinkets, and memories that he clung to desperately. Isabel, on the other hand, tried to move forward. She and Mark began making wedding plans, but the shadow of Adrian's presence loomed over them. Despite her efforts to distance herself from him, Adrian always found a way to intrude. One night, Isabel came home to find Adrian sitting in the darkened living room. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. You're late, he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. I was with Mark, Isabel replied, keeping her tone neutral. I don't need to explain myself to you. Adrian stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. You're making a mistake, he said. You don't see it now, but he's not the one for you. And you are. Isabel shot back, her voice rising. Adrian, this isn't normal. We can't keep pretending this is okay. Adrian's composure cracked. Don't you dare say that, he snarled. You promised me. You said it would always be us. That promise was a mistake, Isabel said firmly. I was a child. I didn't understand what I was saying. Adrian's eyes filled with tears, but his expression hardened. If I can't have you, Isabel, he whispered, then no one can. Mark became increasingly uneasy about Adrian's behavior. One evening, he decided to confront him, hoping to resolve the tension once and for all. He found Adrian at a local bar, nursing a drink in a dark corner. Adrian, Mark said, approaching cautiously. We need to talk. Adrian looked up, his gaze cold and unwelcoming. About what? He asked, his tone laced with mockery. How you're stealing my sister. I'm not stealing her, Mark said firmly. She's not an object. She loves me, and I love her. I want us to find a way to coexist. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. Coexist. That's rich coming from you. You think you can just walk into her life and take her away from me? That's not what I'm doing, Mark said, trying to keep his composure. But you need to let her live her life. You're suffocating her. Adrian slammed his glass onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. She doesn't need you, he said through gritted teeth. She's mine. She's always been mine. Mark shook his head, realizing the depth of Adrian's delusion. You need help, Adrian, he said softly. This isn't healthy. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Get out of here before I do something we'll both regret. Mark hesitated for a moment before walking away, his heart heavy with dread. He knew Adrian's obsession was dangerous, but he didn't realize just how far it would go. Despite Adrian's escalating behavior, Isabel and Mark moved forward with their wedding plans. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the small chapel was filled with friends and family. Isabel stood in her dressing room, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. You look beautiful, her maid of honor said, adjusting the veil. Mark is a lucky man. Isabel smiled, but her thoughts drifted to Adrian. She hadn't seen or heard from him in days, and his silence was unsettling. Part of her hoped he'd finally accepted her decision, but another part feared the worst. As the ceremony began, Adrian watched from a distance, hidden among the trees outside the chapel. He wore a dark suit, his face pale and gaunt. In his pocket was a knife, its blade gleaming as he turned it over in his hands. They don't deserve you, he muttered to himself, his voice trembling with rage. I'll save you, Isabel. I'll make this right. When the ceremony ended and the guests moved to the reception, Adrian made his move. He slipped into the crowd unnoticed, his eyes fixed on Isabel and Mark as they shared their first dance. His heart pounded with a mix of jealousy and desperation. As the music faded, Adrian approached the couple, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. Congratulations, he said, his voice smooth but hollow. Can I have a word with my sister? Mark hesitated, sensing the tension, but Isabel nodded. It's okay, she said. I'll be right back. Adrian led Isabel outside, away from the prying eyes of the guests. Once they were alone, his facade crumbled. Why did you do this? He asked, his voice breaking. Why did you betray me? I didn't betray you, Adrian, Isabel said gently. I'm trying to live my life. You need to let me go. I can't, Adrian said, his hands trembling. You're my everything, Isabel. I can't lose you. You're not losing me, she said, tears streaming down her face. But this isn't right. You need to let go. Adrian shook his head, his desperation turning to anger. I won't let him take you from me, he said, pulling the knife from his pocket. Adrian, no. Isabel cried, backing away. But it was too late. Mark, sensing something was wrong, rushed outside just in time to see Adrian lunging toward Isabel. Without hesitation, Mark stepped in front of her, the blade sinking into his chest. He fell to the ground, blood staining his white shirt. Isabel screamed, dropping to her knees beside Mark as Adrian stood frozen, the knife slipping from his hand. What have I done? He whispered, his voice shaking. The police arrived minutes later, arresting Adrian as Isabel cradled Mark's lifeless body. The wedding guests watched in stunned silence, their joyous celebration turned into a nightmare. Adrian was charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison. Isabel, shattered by the loss of her husband and the betrayal of her brother, moved away from Willow Creek, seeking solace in a place far from the memories that haunted her. Years later, she visited Adrian in prison, their conversation filled with pain and regret. Why, Adrian? She asked, tears in her eyes. Why did it have to end like this? Because I loved you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And I couldn't let you go. As Isabel left the prison, she felt a sense of closure. Though the scars of the past would never fully heal, she vowed to live a life worthy of the love she'd lost. What are your thoughts on this heartbreaking story? Can love ever justify such actions? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales and life lessons.